The piano had 88 keys. 87 of them worked. Martin Kessler has restored antique pianos for 31 years. He told me he'd never been afraid to open one. Until this Bösendorfer. In fact, he admitted something he'd never done before. He locked the workshop door before taking it apart. The piano came from an estate sale in Ridgewood, New Jersey. The owner, an elderly woman named Dorothea Lance, had died with no heirs. The auction company cataloged the house room by room. They almost never found the instrument. It sat in a back parlor behind a door that had been wallpapered over. Not abandoned, sealed, as if someone had decided that room should stop existing. Martin brought the piano back to Connecticut and began a routine inspection. Everything worked except one key, second octave, C sharp. The hammer moved. The string was intact. There was no mechanical reason for silence. But every time he pressed it, nothing. He later told me it didn't feel broken. It felt as though the piano was refusing to speak. He dismantled the action and found something impossible. Beneath the key mechanism, inside a cavity that should never have existed, sat a small brass cylinder sealed with wax. It hadn't been hidden inside the piano. The piano had been rebuilt around it. Someone had permanently sacrificed one note to protect whatever was sealed inside. Martin didn't call me because he found the cylinder. He called because he recognized the seal. It belonged to a composer who vanished in 1946, a man whose work disappeared with him. Martin opened the cylinder anyway. A standard piano has 88 keys. This one had 87 that worked. The 88th made no sound at all. My name is Martin Kessler. I've been restoring antique pianos out of my workshop in Bridgeport, Connecticut for 31 years. Cracked soundboards, warped hammers, ivory so yellowed it looks like old teeth. I've seen all of it. I've rebuilt instruments that survived house fires and basement floods. I've never once hesitated to open a piano. But on the morning I brought this Bösendorfer into my shop, I walked back to the door and turned the lock. I stood there for a moment with my hand still on the deadbolt. I didn't know why. I just knew I didn't want anyone walking in. The piano came from an estate sale in Ridgewood, New Jersey. The owner, a woman named Dorothea Lance, had died 3 weeks earlier at the age of 91. No children. No surviving relatives. The auction company sent a team to catalog the house room by room. They nearly missed the piano entirely. It was in a small back parlor at the end of a narrow hallway, behind a door that had been completely wallpapered over. Not locked, not boarded, wallpapered. Someone had pasted over the frame, the edges, the seams, as if the room behind it was never supposed to be entered again, as if it was meant to stop existing. The crew cut through the paper and found the Bösendorfer sitting alone in the middle of the room. No furniture, no photographs, just the piano, a thin layer of dust, and the smell of aged spruce and silence. I bought it for $1,100. Back in my workshop, I began a standard inspection. Action rail, dampers, hammers. Key by key, I worked through the full range. Everything responded cleanly until I reached the second octave, C sharp. I pressed it. The hammer traveled. The string was intact. There was no dust in the mechanism, no corrosion, no visible damage of any kind. Mechanically, the note should have sounded. It didn't. Absolute silence. I pressed it again, slower this time, watching every component move exactly as it should. Nothing. The piano was simply refusing to speak. At first, I assumed it was a subtle mechanical failure, something I'd missed. I was wrong. The deeper I looked, the more I realized the silence wasn't accidental. It was engineered. I removed the action assembly and laid it on my bench under a work light. And there, beneath the key mechanism, where solid maple should have been. Someone had carved out a precise rectangular cavity. Fitted inside was a brass cylinder, roughly the size of a man's index finger, sealed at one end with dark wax. The cylinder hadn't been dropped into the piano or wedged between parts. The entire key mechanism had been redesigned around it. Whoever did this had permanently sacrificed one note, C#, gone forever, to create a hiding place that no tuner, no mover, no casual player would ever find. I sat on my stool and stared at it for a long time. Then I looked at the seal. 2 letters and a small cross pressed into the wax with a signet. I recognized it immediately. It was the personal mark of Renaud d'Essigny, a French composer who walked out of a concert hall in Lyon on November 14, 1946, and was never seen again. I held the cylinder under the light. The wax was dark, almost black with age. My hands were steady. They're always steady. I broke the seal. The wax didn't break cleanly. It crumbled, dry and black, falling onto my workbench like ash from a letter someone had tried to burn decades ago. A faint breath of trapped air escaped the open cylinder. I can't explain it well, but it smelled like a room that hadn't been opened since the war. Old paper, old dust, something faintly sweet, like dried flowers pressed inside a book no one had read in 80 years. Outside, rain was hitting the workshop windows in slow, uneven waves. The kind of November rain that doesn't stop. It just settles in and stays. I tilted the cylinder under my bench light and used a pair of fine-point tweezers to slide the contents out onto a square of black felt. 2 items. That's all. A single photograph and a folded piece of paper so thin I could almost see through it. The photograph was black and white, roughly 3 by 5 inches, with a scalloped border typical of the late 1930s. It showed a young woman standing on the porch of a house I recognized immediately, the same house in Ridgewood where the piano had been found. She was smiling, not posing, smiling the way people smile when they've forgotten anyone is watching. She looked like she was in her mid-20s. Her hair was pinned loosely. Her eyes were bright and unguarded. It was Dorothea Lance, and she was beautiful. But there was someone standing next to her, a man, taller. His left hand rested gently on her shoulder. I could see the sleeve of his jacket, the shape of his fingers. But where his face should have been, there was nothing. A clean, precise rectangle had been cut from the photograph with a razor blade. Not torn, not scratched out, removed with surgical care, as if someone had sat down with steady hands and deliberately erased him from the image while preserving everything else. I stared at the hollow space where a face used to be. The clean edges of the cut told me something important. This wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of protection. Whoever removed that face didn't want to destroy the photograph. They wanted to make sure that if anyone ever found it, they would see Dorothea, but never identify the man beside her. I thought about what the neighbors in Ridgewood had told the estate company. Dorothea Lance lived in that house alone for over 50 years. She never married. She never had visitors. Groceries and mail were left on the porch. She didn't attend church, didn't appear at town meetings, didn't wave from the yard. The town assumed she was simply an eccentric old woman who had chosen bitterness over company. A recluse, a footnote. But sitting in my workshop, looking at that photograph, at the way she smiled, at the hand on her shoulder, at the missing face, I understood something the town never did. Dorothea Lance wasn't hiding from the world. She was standing guard. For over half a century, she had lived alone in that house, not because she had nothing to protect, but because she had something she would never allow anyone to find. I set the photograph aside and turned to the letter. The paper was onion skin, the kind used for airmail in the 40s, yellowed and brittle, folded twice. I opened it with the tweezers, pressing each crease flat against the felt. The handwriting was elegant, slanted slightly to the right, written in dark ink that had barely faded. It was not Dorothea's handwriting. I knew that because the estate auction had included a box of her personal papers, grocery lists, utility receipts, notes in a tight, practical script. This was different. This was the hand of someone trained in European penmanship, someone who wrote music for a living. The letter was dated October 12, 1946, 33 days before Renaud Dessigny vanished. I read the first line aloud, alone in my workshop, with the rain still falling outside. If you are reading this, then I did not come back, and you have kept your promise far longer than I had any right to ask. I read the rest of the letter slowly, one sentence at a time, the way you handle something that might fall apart in your hands. Renaud Dessigny's handwriting grew tighter as the letter continued, the elegant slant compressing into something more urgent, more desperate, as if the man writing it knew he was running out of time and ink and courage all at once. The words pressed deep into the onion skin paper, like a confession being carved into wood. He wrote about Paris, about the autumn of 1937, when a young American woman arrived at the Conservatoire to study piano under his mentorship. Her name was Dorothea. She was 23. She played with more feeling than technique, he said, and he loved her for it. He loved her for the way she closed her eyes before the first note, as if she were asking the instrument for permission. Within a year, she was no longer his student. She was everything. Then the war came. Dorothea's family demanded she return to New Jersey. She refused twice. The third time, Renaud put her on the boat himself. He told her it would be temporary. He told her he would follow within months. He didn't. France fell, and the occupation sealed him inside a country that was no longer his own. He survived. Not heroically, and he was careful to say that. He taught privately. He composed in silence. He kept his head down and tried to disappear into the wallpaper of occupied Paris. But in the winter of 1943, a former student, a clerk in the prefecture, came to him with a set of documents he had stolen from a locked office. Ledger pages, coded names, dates, and addresses. They contained the identities of collaborators, French citizens, and, more dangerously, American officials stationed in Europe, who had personally handed over families, entire networks to the regime. Hundreds of people, exposed, arrested, deported. All because of the names on those pages. The clerk was shot 2 weeks later. Renaud kept the documents hidden inside the lining of a piano bench for 3 years. After liberation, he expected justice. Instead, he watched the same men resurface, cleaned, promoted, decorated. They sat in new offices with new titles and old secrets they would kill to protect. Renaud understood then that the war had ended, but the monsters had simply changed uniforms, and they knew someone had the ledger pages. He wrote to Dorothea that he could feel them closing in, not soldiers, not police, quiet men in clean suits who asked questions at cafes and disappeared before morning. He had weeks, maybe less, so he made a decision. He arranged to ship his most prized possession, the Bösendorfer Concert Grand, to Dorothea's address in Ridgewood, under the guise of a private estate transfer. Before it left France, he hired a German craftsman, a man who had lost his tongue to a shrapnel wound at Verdun, to rebuild the second-octave C-sharp key. The craftsman carved a cavity into the maple, fitted the brass cylinder inside, and reassembled the mechanism so precisely that the only trace of the alteration was the absence of a single note. One key, one silence, one secret. Renaud begged Dorothea to keep the piano sealed and untouched until the men who were hunting him were dead or gone. He told her she would know when it was safe. He promised he would come for her. But as I read further, the letter revealed something else, something that made me set the page down and sit very still. Renaud mentioned a second object, something he had sent along with the piano that was not inside this cylinder, something hidden elsewhere in the instrument that he called far more dangerous than the letter itself. I looked up from the felt. The rain had stopped. My workshop was completely silent. I stared at the disassembled C-sharp mechanism still spread across my bench, and for the first time I noticed something I had missed entirely during the first inspection. A second set of tool marks on the underside of the brass cylinder, faint but deliberate, forming a pattern that wasn't decorative. It was a map. I almost missed it. The scratching on the underside of the C-sharp key lever was crude, nothing like the precise craftsmanship of the hidden cavity. Someone had used a nail or the tip of a kitchen knife, pressing hard into the maple with an unsteady hand. A date, September 28, 1947, nearly a full year after Renaud Dessigné vanished. And next to the date, two words gouged into the wood in shaky English. They checked. I sat with that for a long time. The workshop was dark except for the bench light. I could hear the building settling around me, the old pipes ticking in the walls. Someone had opened this piano after it arrived in New Jersey. Someone had searched it. And Dorothea, it had to be Dorothea, had scratched a warning into the only place she knew was safe. Not for herself, for whoever came next. She knew they had been inside the instrument, and she sealed it back up anyway. I turned to the piano bench. It had come with the auction lot, listed as a matching accessory, and I'd barely glanced at it. A standard antique bench with a hinged lid and a shallow compartment for sheet music. I opened it. Empty. But when I pressed down on the bottom panel, it flexed. Not warped, loose. I worked my fingers along the edge and felt a seam that shouldn't have been there. A false bottom, fitted so tightly it looked original. I pried it up with a flathead screwdriver. The old wood resisted, then gave way with a dry crack that echoed through the shop like a bone snapping. Two items, pressed flat against the underside of the panel. The first was a newspaper clipping, brittle and brown, torn carefully from what appeared to be a local New Jersey paper. The date printed at the top read October 4th, 1947, 6 days after the scratched warning inside the piano. The headline was small, buried below the fold. Unidentified man killed in late-night hit-and-run on Maple Avenue. The article described a foreign male, no identification, no wallet, struck by a vehicle in front of a private residence at approximately 2 in the morning. No witnesses, no suspects. The body was never claimed. The address listed in the article was Dorothea's house. I read it twice. Then I picked up the second item. It was a letter, typed, not handwritten. A single paragraph on plain white paper, undated, addressed to Miss D. Lance. The typeface was slightly uneven, a European typewriter, the kind with offset vowels and a heavier strike on the consonants. The message was short and direct. It demanded she surrender what it called the Dessigné ledger to a post office box in Washington, D.C. It made no threats. It didn't need to. The newspaper clipping was the threat. Dorothea hadn't wallpapered over that parlor door out of grief. She had done it because the wolves had already found her driveway. She sealed the room, silenced the piano inside it, and spent the next 50 years sitting alone in that house, making sure no one ever opened that door again. Every quiet morning, every unanswered knock, every grocery delivery left on the porch, it was all a perimeter. She had turned her entire life into a lock. I set both items on the felt beside the photograph and the letter. 4 pieces now. A love letter from a doomed man, a photograph with a missing face, a dead stranger on a dark road, and a typed demand from someone who knew exactly what was hidden inside that piano. I started to slide the false bottom panel back into the bench. Then I stopped. Something was stuck to the back of it, pressed flat against the raw wood by decades of pressure. A small, white rectangle. I peeled it off carefully. It was a business card. Clean, modern, printed on heavy stock no older than 3 or 4 years. No company name, no title. Just a handwritten phone number in blue ink and a single line printed in the center. "We know the piano has been sold." The business card sat on the black felt under my bench light like a small, white wound. Heavy stock, crisp edges. The kind of card that costs more to print than most people spend on dinner. No company logo, no title, just a name centered in clean, embossed type. Julian Vance. Below it, a private phone number with a New Jersey area code. Nothing else on the front. I turned it over. On the back, someone had written in blue ink, the same blue ink as the phone number on the front, a short message in a steady, unhurried hand. It was addressed to Dorothea, dated 3 years ago. "We know it's in the wood, Dorothea. Name your price before we take it anyway. Time is running out for both of us." I read it 4 times. Each time the room felt smaller. The name Julian Vance meant nothing to me. But I have a computer in my workshop, an old desktop I use for auction records and client invoices, and within 15 minutes, I knew exactly who he was. Julian Vance, 71 years old, billionaire real estate developer, major political donor in New Jersey and Washington, philanthropist, board member of 3 museums. His face appeared in photographs alongside senators, ambassadors, and 2 former presidents. He lived on a gated estate less than 40 minutes from Ridgewood. But it was his grandfather's name that stopped me cold. Colonel Edward Vance, United States diplomatic attaché stationed in Paris from 1943 to 1947. A decorated officer, a celebrated public servant, and according to a single, half-buried academic paper I found from a French university archive, a man whose name appeared repeatedly in unverified allegations of wartime collaboration with the occupation authorities. Allegations that were never investigated. Allegations that disappeared from the public record entirely by 1949. The désigné ledger, the coded names, the list of collaborators who betrayed hundreds of families and then resurfaced in clean suits after liberation. Colonel Edward Vance was one of those names. He had to be. And his grandson Julian had spent the last 3 generations making sure that list never surfaced. If the Vance family knew the secret was hidden in the wood, why hadn't they simply stolen the piano decades ago? The answer was in the very mechanics I was holding. They couldn't. Dorothea never left the house. She never opened the parlor. She never let anyone inside. For 50 years, she sat in that house like a human vault, and the Vances couldn't touch the piano without touching her first. So they waited. They pressured. They slid business cards under her door and wrote polite threats in blue ink. And when she finally died at 91 with no heirs, they likely assumed the estate sale would deliver the instrument directly into their hands. But they missed the wallpapered door. Their appraisers walked right past it. And a piano restorer from Connecticut bought the Bösendorfer for $1,100 at a public auction before the Vance family even knew the parlor existed. I had the piano. I had the cylinder. I had the letter, the photograph, the clipping, and the threat. And somewhere inside this instrument, somewhere I hadn't found yet, was the actual ledger, the real secret, the one Renaud Designy died to protect, and Dorothea Lance spent her entire life guarding. And now the Vances knew it had been sold. I sat very still in my workshop. The rain had returned, tapping against the windows in soft, irregular patterns. The building was quiet. The street outside was empty. I could hear my own breathing. Then I heard something else, a small, metallic sound, quiet, deliberate, coming from the front of the shop. The door handle, the same lock I had turned 6 hours ago when I first brought the piano inside, shifted slightly. Not a knock, not a push. Someone was standing on the other side of that door, slowly and carefully trying to turn the handle without making a sound. They failed. I didn't breathe. My hand found the iron tuning wrench on the bench behind me, 2 pounds of solid steel, cold against my palm. I stood motionless in the center of the workshop, staring at the door. The handle didn't move again. 10 seconds. 20. A full minute of silence, broken only by the rain and the blood pounding behind my ears. I moved to the window, slowly, keeping my weight on the balls of my feet, the way you do when you don't want the floorboards to speak. I pressed my face against the cold glass and looked out through the streaked rain toward the street. A black sedan sat idling under the street lamp across the road. No headlights, engine running. I could see the faint red glow of taillights reflected in the wet asphalt. It sat there for maybe 30 seconds. Then the lights came on, and the car pulled away slowly, deliberately, disappearing into the rain like a thought someone decided not to finish. They knew where I was. They knew I had the piano, and they would come back. I turned from the window and looked at the disassembled instrument spread across my workshop. Whatever Renaud Designy had hidden inside this piano, I had to find it tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. I picked up the brass cylinder again. I'd already removed the letter and the photograph, but something about the weight still bothered me. It was too heavy for an empty tube. I held it under the magnifying lamp and rotated it slowly. The top had been sealed with wax that was broken, but the bottom... I ran my thumbnail across it and felt a hairline seam, not soldered, threaded. The bottom of the cylinder was a cap, machined so precisely it looked seamless to the naked eye. I fitted my smallest precision pliers around the edge and turned. It resisted, then gave a quarter rotation, then a half, then the cap came free with a soft, metallic whisper. A second chamber, hidden beneath the first. Renaud had built a secret inside a secret. I tilted the cylinder, and a tightly folded ribbon of paper slid onto the felt. I unrolled it with tweezers. It was a single sheet of hand-drawn musical staff paper, 5 lines, inked with the same dark pen as the letter. At the top, in Renaud's elegant script, a title, Berceuse pour Dorothée, Lullaby for Dorothea, written in the key of C-sharp major, the same note he had silenced forever inside the piano. He wrote her a song she could never play on the instrument that held it. I had to sit with that for a moment. The composition was short, 16 bars, a simple, haunting melody that I could almost hear just by reading the notation. But as I studied it under magnification, I noticed something beneath certain notes, tiny, precise pinpricks in the paper. Not damage, not age. Intentional. Each pinprick sat directly below a specific note, spaced at irregular intervals. A pattern within the pattern. The Vance family wasn't looking for a ledger. They were looking for a melody they didn't know how to read. Renaud hadn't written a list of names. He had translated the collaborators' identities, names, dates, account numbers, into a musical cipher. The evidence was the song itself. Every pinpricked note corresponded to something. But without the cipher key, the translation table that converted notes back into letters and numbers, the music was unreadable, beautiful, and completely silent, just like the key that hid it. I stared at the sheet. 16 bars of encoded truth that powerful men had killed to suppress for nearly 80 years. But I couldn't decode it. Not without the key. Then I remembered something. The estate auction catalog. I had skimmed it the morning of the sale. Most of the lots were unremarkable. Furniture, kitchenware, old linens. But there was one item I hadn't bid on. A small, hand-bound notebook listed as Personal Journal, French, circa 1940s. I had ignored it because I was only there for the piano. That notebook was the cipher, and I had left it behind. I didn't need to go back to Ridgewood. The answer was already in my workshop. I just hadn't recognized it yet. When I bought the Bösendorfer at the estate sale, the auctioneer had thrown in a cardboard box of miscellaneous parts, pedal rods, a cracked music rack, some felt strips, and a heavy wooden metronome that had been sitting on top of the piano when they found it. I'd tossed the box into the corner near my tool cabinet without a second thought. That was 6 hours ago. It felt like 6 years. I found the metronome at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a sheet of old newspaper. It was a classic pyramid-style piece, dark walnut, brass winding mechanism, a weighted pendulum arm. Beautiful craftsmanship, probably German, probably 1920s. I held it under the light and turned it over. The brass bottom plate was fastened with 4 small screws. 3 of them were original. The 4th was slightly shorter, slightly newer. Someone had opened this before. I removed all 4 screws and lifted the plate. Pasted to the inside of the wooden base, protected from light and air for decades, was a single sheet of paper, covered in a hand-drawn grid. Rows of musical notes, pitches, intervals, accidentals, matched against columns of letters, numbers, and symbols in both English and French. A translation matrix, the cipher key. The handwriting was tight and practical. Dorothea's handwriting. She had built the decoder herself, probably copied from instructions Renaud sent her, and hidden it inside the one object that would always stay with the piano. I placed the metronome grid next to the sheet music on the felt, the lullaby on one side, the key on the other. A legal pad and a pencil between them. The bench light humming above. Rain still tapping the windows like fingers asking to be let in. I started with the first pin-pricked note, B-flat, 2nd octave. I cross-referenced it against the grid, the letter E. The next pinprick, D-sharp, the letter D. Then A natural, W. Then another and another. Each note became a letter. Each letter joined the last. I wrote them down, one at a time, on the legal pad, my pencil moving slowly, deliberately, like a man diffusing a wire he couldn't see the end of. As the first sentence formed on my legal pad, the true horror of Dorothea's 50-year silence became undeniably clear. The decoded text wasn't a confession. It wasn't a memoir. It was an accounting ledger. Precise, clinical, devastating. Swiss bank account numbers. Corporate shell entities registered in Zurich and Liechtenstein. Dates of wire transfers. Amounts. And beside each entry, a name. Real names. Western diplomats. Intelligence officers. French industrialists. American military attachés. Men who had sold the locations of resistance networks, refugee safe houses, and Jewish families to the occupation authorities in exchange for money that was still earning interest in Alpine vaults 8 decades later. The third name on the list was Colonel Edward Vance. Beside it, 2 account numbers, a Zurich holding company called Edelweiss Fiduciaire, and a transfer amount in 1944, equivalent to roughly $4 million modern dollars. The seed money for everything the Vance family had built since. Every skyscraper, every political donation, every museum wing with their name on the brass plaque. All of it rooted in the blood of families who were betrayed by a man in an American uniform. I kept translating, note by note, pinprick by pinprick. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't stop them. The legal pad filled slowly, 12 names in total, each one a ghost in a clean suit who had walked free while hundreds disappeared into the dark. The final bar of the lullaby held 4 last pinpricked notes. I translated them, expecting another name or account number. Instead, the letters formed a sentence, short, direct, written by a man who knew he was about to disappear. Publish everything. Forgive Dorothea. She only loved me. I followed Renault's instructions, not because I trusted a dead man's judgment, because he was right. The Vance family had spent 80 years making sure the right people owed them favors, judges, prosecutors, committee chairs. Taking this to the authorities would be like handing the evidence back to the people it accused. So I did what Renault asked. I let the truth dismantle itself. Before dawn, I photographed every item on my workbench. The letter, the photograph, the cipher sheet, the metronome grid, the decoded ledger on my legal pad, the newspaper clipping, the business card. I scanned them at high resolution and composed a single detailed email with the full decoded text and every supporting image attached. I sent it to 3 international investigative journalism organizations, the kind that operate out of multiple countries and can't be silenced by a single phone call from a New Jersey estate. Then I sat down and waited for morning. The lawyer arrived at 9:15. He was young, clean-cut, wearing a suit that cost more than my best restoration. He didn't knock. He walked in during regular business hours, as if he were browsing for antiques. He introduced himself as a representative of a private collector interested in acquiring the Bösendorfer. He didn't mention the Vance name. He didn't need to. He offered me a blank check. He set it on the edge of my workbench with a silver pen and smiled the way people smile when they believe money ends every conversation. I picked up my phone, opened the sent folder, and slid it across the bench toward him. 3 emails, 3 timestamps, all before sunrise. "You're too late," I said. "The melody is already playing." The lawyer thought he was buying an antique. He didn't realize he was standing next to a time bomb that had already detonated. I watched his face change, not dramatically, not like in the movies, just a slow drain of color, a tightening around the jaw, the quiet death of a man's certainty. He picked up the check and the pen. He made a single phone call from the parking lot, speaking in a voice too low to hear. Then the black sedan pulled away for the last time. Within 6 weeks, 3 newspapers in 3 countries would publish the decoded contents of Renaud Designy's lullaby. Within 3 months, frozen Swiss accounts dating back to 1944 would be unsealed by international court order. The Vance family's lawyers would issue 17 statements denying everything. It wouldn't matter. The music was already out. But that morning, alone in my workshop, I wasn't thinking about justice or journalism or the Vance empire. I was thinking about a woman who sat in a house in Ridgewood for 50 years, knowing a melody by heart that she could never play. I turned to the piano. I spent the next 4 hours restoring the C-sharp key. I carved a new maple insert to fill the cavity, shaped it to match the original grain, fitted the hammer mechanism back into place, and adjusted the action until the response was identical to the 87 keys that had never been touched. Precise, patient work. The kind of work that lets your hands think while your mind grieves. When I finished, I sat down on the bench. I placed the cipher sheet on the music rack, and for the first time in 80 years, I played Lullaby for Dorothea on the instrument it was written for. The C-sharp rang out on the first bar. Clear, full, warm. A note that had been imprisoned in silence since 1946, finally allowed to speak. The melody was simple, 16 bars of heartbreak dressed in the gentlest harmony I had ever heard. It moved through the workshop like light through old glass, filling corners that hadn't been touched by sound in decades. Each phrase rose and fell like breathing, like someone whispering a name they hadn't said aloud in years. I played it through once. Then I sat with my hands in my lap and listened to the last note fade into the silence of the room. It hung in the air for a long time, that final C-sharp, vibrating in the wood and the walls and somewhere deep in my chest. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. I am not a sentimental man, but some silences, when they finally break, sound like grief. I looked at the photograph one last time. Dorothea, young and radiant on the porch of the Ridgewood house. The man beside her with his hand on her shoulder. The clean, precise rectangle where his face should have been. For days I had assumed it was an act of grief, a woman cutting away the image of someone she had lost. But sitting in my workshop with the decoded ledger and the empty cylinder and the restored piano behind me, I finally understood. It wasn't grief. It was strategy. If the Vance family ever breached her house, if they broke through the wallpaper, found the parlor, opened the piano, and discovered the photograph, they would see a young woman standing next to a man, but they would never be able to prove that man was Renaud Designy. No face, no identification, no connection. Dorothea had taken a razor blade to the only photograph she had of the man she loved, the only proof he had ever stood beside her, and erased him from it. Not to forget him, to protect him. She traded the last image of his face for the safety of his secret. She chose his legacy over her own comfort. And then she lived with that empty rectangle for 50 years, remembering what used to be there every single time she looked at it. That is a kind of love I don't think most people are capable of. The kind that doesn't ask to be seen. The kind that sits alone in a sealed room and keeps watch over a silent piano and never tells a soul. The Vance empire began to collapse quietly, the way empires do, not with a dramatic explosion, but with a slow, irreversible erosion.
Frozen accounts were unsealed. Investigations were opened in 3 countries. Julian Vance resigned from his museum boards and retreated behind his lawyers.
The family name, once printed on brass plaques and marble lobbies, became a footnote in a very different kind of history. The house in Ridgewood was purchased by a local preservation society. They removed the wallpaper from the parlor door and opened it permanently. Sunlight entered that room for the first time in over 50 years, falling across the bare hardwood floor where the Bösendorfer had once stood. They left the room empty. A small brass plaque beside the open doorway reads, "In memory of Dorothea Lance, who kept her promise." I did not sell the piano. I couldn't. Instead, I donated it to a music conservatory in New York, under a single condition written into the transfer agreement. The Bösendorfer must be played by students every day, and its second octave C-sharp key must never be silenced again. The conservatory agreed. They placed the piano in a sunlit practice room on the 3rd floor, overlooking the city. Every morning, students sit down and play scales, etudes, concertos, and sometimes, when the light is right and the room is quiet, a simple 16-bar lullaby in C-sharp major that none of them know the true meaning of. I think about Dorothea often. Not the old woman the neighbors described, the recluse, the eccentric, the bitter shut-in who never answered her door. I think about the young woman on the porch, smiling at someone whose face she would later erase to keep him safe. I think about the decades she spent sitting in that house, listening to the silence of a piano she could never open, guarding a melody she could never play, keeping a promise she was never released from. We walk past old houses every day. We browse estate sales and flip through boxes of forgotten photographs and run our fingers over antique wood without thinking. We assume these objects are silent, that they have nothing left to say. But they aren't silent. They are waiting. Waiting for someone to press the right key, open the right drawer, unfold the right piece of paper. Waiting for someone to listen. Somewhere, right now, in a practice room in New York, a student is playing a C-sharp. The note rises through the open window and disappears into the afternoon sky. It doesn't know where it's going. It doesn't need to. The watch is over. The key is no longer silent. And Renaud and Dorothea, after 80 years apart, are finally resting in the same song.